Every nation on earth is drowning in debt. The United States now carries over $38 trillion, one of the highest levels in its history, still rising. The European Union owes around $14 trillion. Japan, almost $9 trillion. Even oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia or export giants like Germany and China hold massive amounts of debt. But here's the paradox. If everyone is in debt, then who exactly is the lender? That question leads us into the world where money, power, and history intersect. The world of the modern historian. And nothing here is ever as simple as it looks. That $38 trillion isn't just a number, it's $114,000 for every single American. Let that sink in before we travel back to 1694, because the story starts with a king who ran out of gold. Debt isn't just a burden, it is an architectural pillar of the modern world. Every war, every crisis, every rise and collapse stands on this invisible skeleton of IOUAR, and if you follow the trail far enough, one unsettling truth emerges. The world isn't indebted to someone. It is indebted to itself. But that doesn't mean everyone benefits equally. To understand how the global economy ended up suffocating under $315 trillion of total debt, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before credit card swipes or digital transfers, the idea of national debt wasn't born on Wall Street. It was born in war. In 1694, England was fighting France and running out of gold. The king turned to merchants for help. In exchange for a permanent interest payment backed by future taxes, they financed the crown. To manage this new arrangement, the Bank of England was created. It was revolutionary. For the first time, a government could spend money it didn't yet have, and lenders received something priceless, a legal promise that could be bought, sold, and traded. This was the birth of the government bond, the seed of the modern financial system. That seed grew into today's $315 trillion forest. And every 100 days, another $1 trillion of debt is added. Faster than this video can upload, France copied it. The Dutch refined it. The newly independent United States absorbed it to fund its revolution and later its westward expansion. National debt became not a sign of failure, but a sign of credibility. A state's ability to borrow was its ability to govern. Empires once conquered land to extract gold. Now they issue debt to extract interest. The battlefield shifted to the balance sheet. Fast forward 3 centuries, and debt has become the world's dominant export. The U.S. owes $38 trillion. Japan owes over $9 trillion. And global debt grows by $1 trillion every 100 days. Nations borrow, banks lend, and citizens, through taxes, savings, and pensions, become both the borrower and the lender. So who's holding the other end of the rope? Start with the U.S., because its debt is not just national, it is global. About half of its $38 trillion is public debt, meaning it's owed to investors, not other branches of the government. 2/3 of those investors are Americans, banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve. The remaining third, roughly $9 trillion, is foreign. Japan leads with about $1 trillion. China follows with roughly $800 billion. Then the UK, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So when people say America is in debt to China, it's true, but it's only about 2% of the total. Most of America's debt is owed to America itself. So the circle closes. Your taxes pay interest that flows into your future pension. But who controls the circle? That's what the next layer reveals. The Treasury issues bonds, banks, and funds buy them. The Federal Reserve sometimes buys those bonds and creates new dollars in exchange. Americans pay taxes to fund the interest. The interest flows back into American pension accounts. It's a circular mirror. The debt is real, but the creditor is the system's own reflection. And this circularity isn't unique to the U.S. It's global. Japan buys U.S. bonds. The U.S. lends to Europe through the IMF. Europe lends to developing nations through the World Bank. Developing nations lend to wealthy countries by storing their reserves in Western bonds. This is a planetary game of hot potato, except the potato is made of promises every nation holds another's IOU. Every IOU is backed by someone else's IOU. Like a poker table where every player is using borrowed chips, and the only rule that keeps the game alive is no one stands up from the table. One player standing up is all it takes. Greece tried in 2010, and the markets taught the world who really runs the game. But there's a fourth layer, the most powerful of all. The markets behind every sovereign bond stand massive institutions, hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks. These institutions manage tens of trillions of dollars and hold the real power over credit. They decide which countries can borrow cheaply and which must pay painfully high interest to survive. When they lose confidence, currencies collapse, governments fall, and economies reshape overnight. Democracy chooses who governs. Markets choose who survives. And presiding over all of this is the modern high priest, the central bank. Central banks don't just manage debt, they create it. Whenever the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys government bonds, they create new money in exchange. One balance sheet's liability becomes another's asset. Every dollar in circulation represents someone else's debt. Debt-free money does not exist. Every coin, every banknote, every digital dollar carries an invisible IOU engraved into it. That invisible IOU is why your $20 bill is worth $20, and why it could be worth nothing tomorrow. Let's see what happens when the IOU chain breaks. For decades, this cycle worked because it was built on trust. As long as investors believed governments would pay the interest, even if the principal was never repaid, the machine kept running. What happens when trust breaks? We've seen it before. In 2010, Greece's debt became unpayable. Bondholders panicked. Yields exploded. The ECB and IMF intervened, but their help came with harsh conditions: higher taxes, spending cuts, mass unemployment. For an entire generation, rescue meant sacrifice. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned debt into a national curse. In Sri Lanka, lack of foreign currency to pay interest triggered fuel shortages and political collapse. When systems break, creditors become visible. The IMF, rating agencies, anonymous bondholders, the ones capable of squeezing nations by the throat, yet after every collapse, the same logic restarts. New loans replace old ones. Old debts are restructured. The machine operates again, often under a new name, because in the 21st century, debt isn't designed to be repaid. It's designed to be rolled over. Governments don't plan to pay off debt. Not now, not ever. This isn't conspiracy. It's policy. When you take a personal loan, you're expected to repay the principal. Governments, however, survive by refinancing. They issue new bonds to pay old bonds. Economists call this rollover debt. Interest is the product, the rent of stability. The global economy has become dependent on this rent. Like a shark that must keep swimming to breathe, the U.S. will never repay its $38 trillion in full. Japan hasn't paid off its debt in decades. Its debt-to-GDP ratio is now over 250%, yet yields are near zero. Investors aren't waiting to get their money back. They're waiting to renew the agreement. Why? Because government debt is considered the safest asset in the world. A U.S. Treasury bond is not a burden. It's a foundation. Pension funds need it. Banks use it as collateral. Central banks treat it as money. The system doesn't need governments to erase debt. The system needs them to maintain it. Paying off the debt would collapse the system faster than defaulting. That's the trap we're in, and the only way out is more debt. But what if the world stops lending? Imagine if Washington decided to pay off the entire debt tomorrow. Banks and funds would lose their most stable assets. The money supply would shrink dramatically. Deflation and collapse would follow. Paying the debt would destroy the very structure that holds the economy up. So governments do the opposite. They add to it rhythmically. Debt becomes the heartbeat of capitalism, pumping through every pension payment, every mortgage, every stock market. That's why political promises to eliminate the national debt are illusions. The goal is not to repay it, but to keep it sustainable, payable, and desired. Because the moment trust collapses, the numbers collapse with it. Confidence falls, yields spike, and an economy built on revolving promises freezes. And here lies the real secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to repay it. The plan was to keep the world believing it would be repaid. It is a closed loop built entirely on trust. And as long as that trust survives, the numbers can stretch into infinity. But trust is not equal for everyone. We owe the debt to ourselves is only half true. Interest payments do not flow evenly. They flow upward to institutions and investors, away from workers and taxpayers. This is why global inequality rises alongside global debt. The system rewards those who hold debt and punishes those who pay it. Your tax dollar flows up. Their bond coupon flows down. Same system, different floors. The pyramid is complete. Now let's look at the very top. If this story feels familiar, it's because the same structure repeats. From individuals to nations, from nations to the entire planet. Creditors are not villains. Debtors are not victims. They are two faces of the same engine. The real question is, what happens when the engine runs out of fuel? What happens when new debt can no longer cover old promises? At that moment, who is the creditor stops being an abstract question and becomes a personal one. Because at the top of this global pyramid, there is no single villain. Not China, not Wall Street, not the IMF. It's all of them. And us modern finance has turned debt into money. Governments issue it, banks multiply it, investors trade it, and citizens depend on it. Debt once meant bondage. Today, it means balance. But if that balance ever breaks, if trust evaporates, the illusion ends. And we remember the truth. Debt is a promise that can't be kept forever. Comment 2030 if you want the next video. What happens when the trust finally breaks? I'll see you there. Firefly. Screen cracks, 2030, bleeding through the fracture. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has the answers. Let me show you where to look.